Hello and welcome to SQL Server Analysis Services 106, Basic Deploying, Processing, and Browsing. This video is a follow-on to the previous videos that showed building a cube using the Cube Wizard, because typically the next step is to simply deploy that cube, process it, and then browse it before doing a lot more work. Or even if you do decide to do some more work, especially on the dimensions first, this will show you at least the basics of how do you go about publishing that and then looking at the data to make sure that the structure is correct. The first thing that you will do typically after building a cube is to go about deploying it. And actually, that's the only step that a lot of people realize, at least when they're first getting into building cubes, is they just tell it to deploy. And actually there are three distinct things that are occurring when you choose to deploy a cube. And that is build is the first one, and you can actually do this by itself. And what the build process does is verify the file structure. It makes sure all the dimensions and cube files are correct, and any aggregations and partitions you've set up and so forth. It verifies all of those items. But then it also builds several local files, and that's what I'll focus on when I get into the demo in just a moment. Then the deployment process takes those files that are built and sends them to the target server. So it uses XMLA to send those files using either TCP/IP or potentially HTTP, but generally it uses TCP/IP, sends those files to the server, and they are executed. And the execution process basically builds those objects on that server. So if you sent, for example, a series of dimensions and a cube file with it, it would go ahead and build the structure for those objects as part of the deployment process. Then the third phase is the actual processing phase, which goes out to the source systems and reads the data and populates those dimension and cube structures with the data, and potentially builds aggregations and indexes and whatever else it needs to do in order to process the cube. Now, I've mentioned that this can look like a single phase from BIDS because you can actually just click deploy and it will do the build and then the deploy, and by default when you deploy it does processing as well. So I'll show you those settings in just a moment, and then we'll actually look at those three distinct phases. Once you have processed the cube, or sometimes just a dimension, you can actually go and look at the data, and that's just called browsing, and there is a built-in browser both for dimensions and the cube itself. And you can go in and simply drag over attributes and look at those. You can, of course, add any measures that you want when you're browsing the cube, and you can drag over hierarchies and expand and collapse those. You can build your own kind of on-the-fly hierarchies just using attributes. And the browser in BIDS is really good for just verifying the structure. It's not meant for end users, very much a designer type tool, just again for verification. There are a couple of minor things that the browser doesn't do or doesn't do very well, but those, again, it's just for verifying the structure. I'll talk more about that in future videos when I talk about client tools. And so let's jump into this and take a look. Now, I'm going to do one quick thing, and that is if you happen to be using Visual Studio 2008 or BI Dev Studio 2008, you saw in the previous video that the 2008 Cube Wizard doesn't add very many attributes. It only adds the keys, basically. So before you get into this, if you happen to be using 2008, you'll probably want to add a couple of attributes. So that's what I'll show you to start. Here I have the Learn MSBI project in 2008. And remember from the dimensions discussion before, very little is actually added to the dimensions by the 2008 wizard. So for example, if I open the product dimension, only the key values are here. And I will go ahead and in the data source view, and we'll see more of this in future videos when I spend a lot more time processing and working with dimensions. Let me zoom in just a little. I'll go ahead and grab, for example, the English product subcategory name. I'll just drag it over and drop it as an attribute. Same thing with the English product category name, and then in the product table itself, the English product name. So just dragging and dropping those, that will allow me now to browse with the name in the 2008 cube. So if you want to go ahead and if you're using 2008, add a few attributes, that's fine, before continuing with the rest of the process. Now I'll go ahead and jump into 2005 because it has all of the columns added as attributes, and therefore will give me a lot more to show you in the browser when we get to that point. So here I am in 2005, and the first thing I want to show you is that there is a directory where the files exist. And by default that is, well, it depends on your operating system a little bit, but you'll notice here it's Documents and Settings, then the name of the person, in this case Administrator, and then My Documents, Visual Studio 2005 or 2008, Projects, and then the name of the project, Learn MSBI. You'll notice there are a series of files here. There's a .dsv file, which of course is the data source view. You have the data source itself with a .ds file extension. You have .cube, .partition, and then all the dimensions. And then there are some other files in here as well. But there are no subdirectories in this directory at the moment. So if I go back to the project and choose on the build menu to simply build solution, or I could build just this particular project, it's one and the same at this point. If I pick build and return to the files here, the directory, you'll notice that two subdirectories have been added, bin and obj. Well, if I go into the obj directory, there is a development subdirectory to it, and there's a single XML file here, lastbuilt.xml. This is a very simple file. It just contains some information about the build and the different versions, the timestamps, and some additional information about each object, the DSV, each dimension, and of course later on the cube. So this just contains some information about what it is that I'm actually building. If I go back up though to the bin directory, that's where the files really are that we're more interested in. The bottom three here, the .config settings, .deployment options, and .deployment targets are relatively small, as you can see from the sizes, and they're fairly simple. I'll just show, for example, the deployment targets is very simple. It simply says what is the target server that I'll publish to when I'm ready to deploy, and of course it is just localhost at the moment. And I'll show you where to change that setting in the project itself coming up. The real file here though is the .as database file, of course AS Analysis Services database file, and this particular file contains everything about the project as far as the DSV, the dimensions, the cube. It's a very large file, and I'll just show you quickly kind of what that looks like. You notice here there is an area for the dimensions, and then each dimension is listed here, dim time, and then every attribute of that dimension is listed. If I continue on, you'll see additional items, and I'm hitting page down here so you can see exactly how large this file is, and I'm holding down page down at this point, and it continues on and shows all of the dimensions. That we'll get into the cubes and the partitions, and if you have any calculations or KPIs, all of that is in here. All of that will be in this particular file. You'll notice here, for example, here it ends the dimensions and starts the cubes. So very large file, but this will be deployed and actually executed, and this is what will create the objects on that server. So at this point, I've only done the first phase. I've done the build portion that I talked about before. Now, the second portion of the process is, if I go into the build menu and deploy, it will do the deploy and the process by default. So before I do that, in order to help you see the definition a little bit better, I'm going to make a minor change to this. In the project, I'm going to right click on the name of the project and choose Properties. Now, In the project properties, I have an option here for deployment, and this shows several items, and one that I'm interested in is the processing option. Right now is default. If something needs to be processed, it will process it. So I can drop this down and say do not process, or always do a full process. Just empty everything out and pull the data fresh every time. Well, in this case, just to show you these three separate phases here, I'm going to choose do not process. And there are some other options we'll talk about later in later videos. Another option here you'll notice is the server, the target, what I'm publishing to, and then what is the name of the database. By default, it will set the server name to localhost and the database to whatever the project name happens to be. Obviously, you can change that here, but for now, I'll leave those set as they are. So I'll click OK, and now all I've done is change it to tell it not to process when I deploy. So now I'm going to choose Deploy Solution. And this copies that AS database file up to the server. And you'll notice down here in the lower left-hand corner it says Deploy Started. So the deploy is occurring, and we have a little animation down in the lower right-hand corner to show that occurring. And once that's done, it will actually again create those empty dimension objects and the cube object on the server. Now, you'll notice a deployment progress window has opened up, and this is where the file has finally reached the server and is executing, and the items are actually again created then on the server. And deployment is successful, so that's it. So normally, had I not changed that processing option, it would now begin the process of pulling data from the sources and loading the dimensions and cubes. And you would see that in this processing window as well, the deployment progress window. So the third phase of this is to actually do the process, and depending on what you have clicked at the time, you may or may not see process. You notice I didn't have it before. I'd probably clicked on something like the deployment progress window and you don't see process here. I'll just click back on the data source view, something in the project itself, and now I have process. There are a number of processing options. It thinks I've changed something locally, and then it realizes, no, in fact, you haven't. So that happens once in a while. It gets out of sync when you click from a project window to a non-project window and back. But when you choose to just do a process, you'll get a dialog that looks like this. And there are many options for processing. You'll notice default, full, data, structure, unprocessed. There are actually some more that you can run from a script. And then there are additional settings down here. But for now, we won't worry too much about this. This is what I want, process full on the cube, which is going to have to do the dimensions as well. Nothing's been processed before. So if I just go ahead and click Run, this will open up a window and show the progress of the processing. Notice it is processing first the dimensions, and in a moment it will come up and process the cube as well. In each one of these, the dimensions, I can expand this, and in this case, the dim currency has just two attributes really. There's an all that's added, but then there is a currency alternate key and a dim currency. If I expand these, you'll notice that each one of these does have a SQL query, and you can see the syntax for that. Each one is a select distinct. So this can be a very long process on large cubes because every attribute in every dimension gets a select distinct query run against it. And when you have very large dimensions, of course, this can take a very long time. So now the cube is in the process of, it's in the process of being processed. The cube has begun processing, and now it's done. So that is where it has read all the data from the fact tables. Again, that's usually where the bulk of the time is because the fact tables are so large. But now process is succeeded, it's done. I can close this, and it's now time to browse the data. So I'm in my cube here, not the DSV, but I'm in the cube. And if I click on the browser window, and I'll shrink the Solution Explorer and the deployment progress windows here in a moment to give it some more room, this is where I can actually go in and start looking at the data. And this is connecting to the server and actually hitting that cube that you have just processed. So at this point, the browser has loaded, and along the left-hand side you see the cube AdventureWorks, all the measures and then all the dimensions. I'll expand the measures here and simply grab the sales amount measure from the Fact Internet Sales and drop it into the details area. Now you have a number here. It's not formatted very well. It certainly doesn't look like a currency, but this number represents the total sales amount for all products, all customers, all time. That's just the grand total of everything that's in the cube. And if you want to explore this in several other ways, you have some options here. I'll choose dim product for a moment. And in the 2008 cube, I just very quickly added the English product category name. I could just drag that over and show what that would look like in either cube. You have accessories, bikes, and clothing, and it breaks the numbers down and it keeps a grand total here. I then added the English product subcategory name, and if I add that, notice it does act like this is a hierarchical structure. It's not the way I've done it, although we do have a hierarchy that has this. But notice I can expand accessories into things such as bike racks, bike stands, bottles, and cages, and so forth. Bikes, I can expand those into mountain bikes, road bikes, touring bikes. It would be just as easy, because each one of these works like a dimension, to switch these around and say, okay, bike racks, under what category? Only accessories. And I don't know if any of these fall under multiple categories. I don't believe they do. Typically you want to avoid that. I'll talk about that in future videos. But you can, of course, put these in the order. If you're coming from the 2005 world, or I'm sorry, the 2000 world, this looks completely different. You can't do this in 2000. Everything has to be built as a hierarchy. Here, you can treat any individual attribute as its own little hierarchy. In fact, Microsoft calls them attribute hierarchies, even though they're not multiple levels. Here is a multi-level hierarchy called products. I'll bring that over. And notice right now, this is using the key values, not the names. It's using the product category number, the subcategory number, and in fact when I get down to the individual products, again it's using the key values. Easy to fix, and that's what we'll be doing in future videos, talking about modifying these dimensions tremendously. Now it's not just working, I'll go ahead back to the English product names here. It's not just working with products, although that's a good thing to show here. Let me grab the English, the English product category name. I have this on the rows, of course, but I can also add items to the columns. For example, I could grab ship date, and there's a ship date calendar I'll add to the column. And you notice it does break down appropriately now across time as well. And I could do things such as expand 2007, and it breaks it down into the quarters of 2007. And I could expand then the second quarter into the months, of course, 4, 5, and 6, April, May, and June, and then April down into the individual days of April, and you do see sales for those. I could also, if I wanted, add yet other dimensions to this. I could, for example, take the customer dimension, and I have information here about this. Normally you wouldn't probably analyze by a person's last name, you wouldn't really care, but for example, I could go ahead and add that either to the rows or the columns, or I have an area up here, and I could use a filter expression, and this will bring back to me a list of all of the last names, and I could say I only want it where the last name happens to be, and I'll scroll down and choose the most common last name in the United States, which happens to be Smith. And once I come back to the lower area, the data is filtered for people whose last names happens to be Smith. So the data has changed accordingly. So that's just a very simple use of the browser. Now, there's a lot more you can do with it. I just want to point out one major issue that people sometimes have with the browser. If I go in and make any kind of change that requires me to redeploy, it will break the current connection. So I'll come back to the cube structure for a moment, and I'll make a very simple change. Over here I have, I'm not even going to affect anything that's actually on the query at the moment. So dim promotion, I haven't done anything with that. But I click on that and go to properties and change the name of that from dim promotion to just promotion. So at this point I will redeploy. And you notice it deploying here in the window. And now the deploy has completed. And if I go back to the browser, it says the cube has been reprocessed on the server. To prevent possible browsing errors, click Reconnect. And that is the third button on the toolbar. You notice if I hover over it, it says Reconnect. So I simply click on the Reconnect, and now, of course, the query is the same, so it didn't look like the data changed, although it did refresh it. And if I come over here and look at my dimensions, you'll notice that promotion has in fact been renamed to simply promotion as opposed to dim promotion. So again, anytime you redeploy something, it will require you, if you come back to the browser, it will still show the old query, but if you try to do anything, you'll get an error, and you just have to click that Reconnect. And in summary, publishing, for lack of a better term, is really a three-step process. You build, it creates that AS database file and a few other files. You then deploy, you copy that AS database file to the server, and it creates the objects in an empty fashion. And then the third step is it processes, it pulls the data from the sources and fills those objects it just created. Now, that's not entirely true. You'll see later that you can do transactional deployments, and in fact that's on by default. It only sends changes, so it's not going to tear down a dimension with all the data in it if you are only affecting something else, a different dimension. But again, a future video on deployment and all the things that occur there, and on processing, that will happen at some point in the future. Finally, you saw browsing data. It's just really to verify that the structure is correct, that you can browse the data and look at it as necessary.